In this episode of Shining a Light on Workplace Bullying, we are talking to Dr. Janice Harper, a cultural anthropologist and author of the book called Mobbed: What to Do When They Really Are Out to Get You. A target of academic mobbing herself, Dr. Harper has applied her expertise in the cultural foundations of warfare and genocide to how humans organize to attack others in the workplace, school, community, and other social settings. She currently works as a ghostwriter and writing coach and has helped many targets of mobbing, bullying, and violence write about their own experiences and healing journeys. Hi, Janice. Thank you so much for joining me tonight on this podcast, Shining a Light on Workplace Bullying, which I started together with Eylem. Unfortunately, she cannot be here today, as I told you, but I'm very curious. I'm sure she's eagerly waiting to listen to the recording as well and hear your story and learn from your insights about this topic. So maybe to start off, it would be lovely if you could just say a few words about yourself and
Sure. I'm Janice Harper, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. And I actually don't write about or talk about bullying as much as I do about mobbing, collective aggression, when people organize and gang up. And I was a professor of anthropology for many years. And after I asked my department chair to speak with an instructor about some of his behavior, I suddenly found like my career exploded and it got crazier and crazier, the accusations made against me. And I reacted very badly. I became furious in response to how I was being treated. And I ended up losing my job, my career, all of my friends, my home, my retirement, my life savings, everything blew up overnight. And I found myself a 50-year-old single mother with nothing. A lawsuit, which I don't recommend if you can avoid it. But and I settled with my university and rebuilt my life. And I now work as a ghostwriter and writing coach. But in the process, I began reading about bullying as this was happening. And as I was reading it, at first it was like, yeah. This is what happened. This is what happened. But then it was like, no. This is, they're talking about gang up on the bullies and get rid of them. And I'm thinking, now you're advocating what happened to me. And while I was never called a bully, I had no doubt that if it had been popular at the time, that's what they would have said to drive me out. Oh, she's a bully. Oh, well, in that case, let's get rid of her. And so I had been teaching about warfare and genocide. And as an anthropologist, we look at group behavior. So as I was giving lectures on genocide, I'm beginning to note some parallels about the ways in which in genocide we find that some of the greatest atrocities are committed by the neighbors and friends of the victims. And I thought, well, this, clearly I was never subjected to anything as horrific as genocide, but the group psychology seemed quite, in the pattern stages, seemed quite consistent. I began noticing some parallels. So I wrote a book, Mobbed: What to Do When They Really Are Out to Get You, which I wish I had read at the time. People began giving me advice, but it wasn't given to me in the language I needed to hear it in at the time. I was in a state of trauma, and they were telling me, don't trust anyone. Well, what I heard was, don't trust any of the bad people, but you can trust your friends. And I was intrigued by how in anti-bully literature, one of the things is this happened, these are psychopaths, these are bad people. But what intrigued me was how many good people turned bad in the process. So that's what my book looks at. I looked at animal behavior. I looked at group psychology to find how it is that in a group setting, whether that's in the workplace, the school, a church, whatever it is, a community, how it is we can get good, decent, humane people to act so abhorrently against another person. And if you are that other person, how you can stay sane and survive it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that was what I noticed immediately when I started looking into your book and the articles you've written and so on. And this exactly this perspective that you have, that you're actually distinguishing between mobbing and bullying. And you talk about the group aggression case of which you call mobbing. And I think it's such an important perspective, and one that I haven't seen it either anywhere else when I've been studying the topic, because the first thing you do when you have some kind of experience like that is to try to learn and understand what happened. I was really intrigued by that perspective, and as you say, that it comes from studying genocide. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, especially this idea of how actually good people turn bad.
Mm-hmm.
That is really scary.
A lot of it comes from making the target out to be a threat and inherently bad. And so we see with genocide, the first thing they do in a genocidal context is it usually happens there's social instability going on. And then a specific group is targeted as is labeled as different. And then that difference is given meaning. And that meaning is a threat. They're a threat to us in our way of life. And then someone in a position of power makes it clear that they want this group of people out, that when we get rid of these people, this kind of people, we'll be, back to how we were. This is, all of our problems are due to this group of people. And then people begin to learn that if they, that people in a position of power want to get rid of this other group of people, then they are marginalized. They are not given access to resources. They are not treated as well. And soon they realize that associating with this group of people brings consequences, negative consequences. But avoiding that group of people, reporting any behavior, brings benefits. And so that is how it begins. And as it goes on, what happens is what we call the small betrayal. Once a person has betrayed the other, we know that human betrayal is a powerful, powerful experience. It has a powerful psychological impact. And that's because our species is a social, we depend on others for our survival. So if the people close to us turn against us and betray us, that affects us at a really primal level. And we know that. So if we betray someone close to us, we know that there's a potential for them to seek retribution. And to avoid that retribution, then the idea is we have to completely destroy them. That's how it works in genocide. So how does this work in the workplace or community setting? Is someone in a position of leadership, let's say a manager, makes it clear that this person is not like the rest of us, that this person is causing a lot of trouble, that this person is actually a threat to your advancement. And little by little, people begin to understand, well, if I hang out with that person, I am going to, I might not get promoted, or I might not get any benefits. They're excluded from meetings. They're excluded from raises, from social events. So the process of exclusion begins. And then as they, as as it worsens, the person becomes once you start being shunned and excluded, you start feeling demoralized. And, there are a whole series of tactics that management can engage in. And usually there are inquisitions, there are reports made. People realize if you make a report, as one student said to me, you told us if we came forward and made these reports, you'd change our grades and give us A's, and she would never know. And so you have these, anonymous reports. And then in a workplace setting, let's say you have a gender discrimination, race discrimination, age discrimination case, what they will find is suddenly the person who's targeted might think, well, other women will be on my side. Other people like me and my group are going to be on my side. And it can actually be quite the opposite, because what they do is they start showering the other person with benefits. So like, okay, we have a potential gender discrimination lawsuit. We got a couple other women here. Let's start giving them promotions and benefits. And that defeats that claim. So they make that small betrayal, and it will usually be like behind closed doors of like, oh no, we know you're friends, so we don't want to, we don't want to put you in any kind of position, but we know it must be really, really difficult for you. And they'll nod and say, yes. And that's the small betrayal. They agree that yes, this person, and the person is, if you're being mobbed, if it goes from bullying to mobbing, where it's not just one person, it's a number of people, you become a pain in the ass. You just, you are not sleeping well, you're not thinking clearly and focusing, you're temperamental because you're really upset about what's happening. You're demoralized. You can be extremely upset. You might cry at odd times. You're shut off from meetings and things, so you don't know things that are going on. You start making mistakes. And a very common one that I was terribly guilty of, and I see it all the time now with mobbing targets, is you talk incessantly about it. And that drives anyone away. So we see those things happening, and I don't see that well explained or in the anti-bully paradigm. And in many cases, I think that the anti-bully paradigm undermines an understanding of these processes.
Mm. Yeah, because what I also always used to say is that bystanders are reinforcers, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what I thought was very interesting in your work was this really explaining the psychology behind how can anybody actually become a bully. And I think you say that they don't even realize there is some kind of cognitive dissonance or going on, or like almost like a mass psychosis, or I don't know what to call it.
Well, what happens is we have this tendency to think, and I hear this all the time, it wasn't mobbing, they deserved it. We aren't bullies, they deserved it. And Gary Namey, who runs what he calls the anti-bully workshop, I don't know, something in Bellingham. He said he is vicious to other people who disagree with him. He's incredibly vicious, and it's okay because we're the good guys. And you see this time and time again, the idea that we can abuse other people when we've convinced ourselves that we are the good guys and we're working on behalf of the organization for the greater good. And so this other person is a bully. They are a threat. We have to get rid of them. And so that is how people begin to convince themselves it isn't bullying if we do it. It's, and then it's very common. The other person is cast as the bully. Oh, they're the bully. And well, everybody says they're a problem. They're always making complaints. They might be complaining about how they're being treated. Well, that's always making complaints. Oh, they blew up at me. They're under all this stress. They're not sleeping. They lose their temper at how they're being treated. And their moods are erratic. We've gone around and talked to other people and elicited stories about them. We've got, so you encourage this atmosphere of rumors, and as the rumors are spread, they begin to gain, new details. Because nobody shares the same rumor over and over and over. It's not interesting. So as we tell rumors, we make them more interesting by making them, by exaggerating certain things. So pretty soon the person, a person can easily be labeled a bully who has never acted aggressively. And I have said consistently that the bully label will never stick to the most aggressive person. It will stick to the person with the least amount of power. Mm-hmm. And as I say that, I am in no way advocating bullying at work. It's quite the opposite. What I resist is that label of people as bullies, because it is a dehumanizing label. And in every case of mobbing I've ever seen, there has been some type of dehumanizing language used to describe them. And that's another thing that we see in genocide. They're no longer, the labels used dehumanize them, so that, whether it's they're animals, they're vermin, they're liberals, they're woke, they're whatever it is that we do, or they're immigrants, that we use some kind of label that takes away their humanity to justify the abuse we inflict on them.
Yeah, because I think the first thing that hit me as well when I heard you talking about mobbing in this way, or the way you described it as group aggression, was, I mean, just looking back at the last couple of years, right? A lot of things happened. And I'm just curious, because at least for me, it kind of clicked and explained some things that I feel like I've seen maybe quite recently. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that as well, not just necessarily on workplace bullying, but like these dynamics show up, and people don't seem to realize.
Well, we certainly see it on the world stage right now. It's it's really palpable in America, but all across the world, in which immigrants, anyone who's viewed as a threat to our way of life. And you see that then in organizations, and and part of it is too, if we don't join in with the beliefs of our friends, we become marginalized. So we quickly fall into line with what our friends, or the members of our church, or the members of our club, or what other people are saying and thinking, and we quickly accept that if someone says someone is a threat, there's little questioning about what makes them a threat, other than the, rumors, speculation, whatever. But we don't really look at a lot of evidence. If we hear someone's a threat, all of a sudden our guard is up. And so that's one of the things that happens in an organizational setting. And one of the criticisms, I've been criticized a lot, is victim blaming, because one of the things I say is, let's look at ourselves and our own reactions. And that's because once this begins, once it starts happening, we become so emotionally disturbed that we act in ways that can, in many cases, can encourage more of the same and feed into that image we're a threat. You lose your temper, people perceive you like this is reinforcing the rumors we've heard that you're a threat. Now, in my case, mine was actually an absurd extreme. They said I was building a hydrogen bomb and subjected me to a Homeland Security investigation. It got so crazy, it was just unbelievable. Yeah. But I hear all kinds of stories. There's the label of a threat is always made in some way, shape, or form. Like, you take an African-American male and he can readily be, or even woman, be labeled, they're violent, and it feeds into those stereotypes. Or, the crazy woman, whatever, they feed into these, so these stereotypes are employed. And another criticism, and so my thing of, look at take a look at ourselves is I think if you say, there's nothing you did to bring this on, you are not at fault, you had nothing to do with it. This happened to you because you are so good at what you did and they're jealous. Problem with that, it might be the case, that might absolutely be the case, but that suggests if you're lousy at your job, you can't be bullied. Not true. Lousy workers can be bullied and often are, or mobbed. It also says there's nothing you did to bring it on. There's nothing you could have done to stop it. And that tells you wherever you go, you're powerless. And I think it's much more empowering to look at our own actions and reactions and reflect on how it is that we became targets and that how it is that we reacted in ways that fan the flames. Doesn't mean we deserved it. Doesn't mean it wouldn't have started in the first place. But there are things we can do to reflect. There's a popular, for example, popular show in the US used to be Frasier about, this guy, he lives with his dad. He's a real arrogant psychiatrist, and his dad is a working class guy. And he and his brother, the Frasier character and his brother, are talking about when they were bullied as kids. And someone says, why did that happen? And they said, well, because they were jealous of us. And the dad just shakes his head and he says, well, maybe if you weren't wearing bowler hats and carrying briefcases at the age of 9, it wouldn't have happened. And I thought it really captures that there are things that we do that that maybe are maladaptive. So I think that we do need to have some self-reflection, and that and again, it doesn't mean we deserved it, but trying to understand it. And another area that I criticize is that this is all by psychotics. The people who do this are bad, and they're bad people, and they're not. If there some are real jerks, and some are just, wherever they go, they're going to target somebody. But there are also those people who they're careerists, or they feel vulnerable. They hear these rumors. When people, like one student who said, I had only one student in my class. Every other student was interviewed and said, this is insane. But she said, I've never known Dr. Harper to say anything violent. I have never known her to do anything violent, but I've heard from so many people she is, that I realize her lecture on the atomic bomb was actually her way of telling us she was building one. It gets that crazy.
Yeah, it's incredible how out of hand these things can go. But I really like your idea of that we also have to have introspection. It's something I also, in my own experience, also something I always say, to work on our emotional triggers. That's like a true superpower, because when we are not so reactive, then they don't have any bullets to shoot us with, bullets, sorry, to shoot us with, because then it's a completely other way of influencing and coming across. And of course, as you say, when that is the most difficult thing, I mean, to not react emotionally when you are being targeted with a maybe an even very unfair and completely wrong accusations. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how did you deal with it at the time
badly,
and afterwards?
Very badly. The book I wrote was like, this is what I should have read.
Yeah.
No, and a number of different things. I never should have said anything in the first place. I just, went to my chair when I consulted a colleague who said, you got to tell Andy what's going on. And I had underestimated Andy. I didn't realize what an absolute bully this man was. And and it was foolish, because in hindsight there was example after example that showed this particular manager was a bully. Okay, but that's just one person. So how does it happen to the whole group? Well, a lot of it became my responses. I come from a working class Midwestern family where, auto workers united against management. And so in an academic setting, I'm thinking, they pull this shit. You tell the workers. No, it doesn't work that way. So I was very openly outraged when my chair told me that had I not said anything, I would have been tenured, but because I brought it up, I should be denied tenure. When 2 weeks before he had written in my report, I was indispensable to the department. So that outraged me, and I let people know my outrage. And I see that as a class thing where, the working class learn that anger is strength. And I've never been violent, but I was angry, but anger at an injustice was a different thing. And so that became easy for them to make me out to be crazy and a threat. Another mistake I made was, okay, and then how does it get to the point where you're accused of building a hydrogen bomb? I was teaching about warfare and doing research on depleted uranium. Had I been teaching about sexual deviance, I would have been accused of sexual deviance. Had I been teaching about drugs at the time, I would have been accused of a drug offense. So it became what is easy to get people scared about. And as one woman said, that what makes you so scary is how you appear so sane, so that the very fact of that I wasn't, even when I wasn't exhibiting anger or anguish, the fact that I appeared normal made them think, well, she must be psychotic then for them to be saying these things about her. So I was, and the second thing that really made it worse for me is how I exhausted my friends with my constant talking about it. It's all I could think of. And this is a very common trait. It's obsessive thinking. A neurological loop happens in your brain where all you can think about is what's going on. And in my book, I tell readers some ways in which to control that I had to learn for myself how to stop that constancy of obsessing about it.
Yeah.
A third thing that made it worse for me is I didn't get out when, well, I'll go back to there was another one thing, but I didn't get out when it was clear that this is happening and people were saying, you need to leave. I would think, it's not right. I earned tenure. The whole paper trail says that. There are no tenured women. They said I won't be given tenure because I reported this guy, and I didn't even want any kind of sexual harassment investigation. I just want to talk to the guy, He won't talk to me, have a talk with him. He's interfering with my work. I should have left, but instead I'm thinking it's not fair. Well, because I didn't leave early on and fought so openly and publicly, my whole career was destroyed. And it had a much larger psychological impact on me. So I should have, and I tell people this all the time, at the very least, get your resume out there. Be prepared to leave, even if it's not fair, even if it means starting over. And the third thing was I kept thinking that my friends wouldn't turn against me when ultimately, just like in genocide, the people closest to me became the most damaging. They told the worst lies, they spread the worst damage. And that was because they made those small betrayals and they knew, and there were huge rewards. One woman was given early tenure and a raise that had been budgeted for my tenure. Others were given raises and promotions. And I mean, there were, grade changes. There were all kinds of rewards paid to those who participated. But in my head, I thought, like I embrace that anti-bully paradigm of look for the bad guys. Who are the psychotics people here? Who are the bullies? Who are the bad people? They weren't nearly as damaging as the good people became.
Yeah. I read, there's a book, I forget now, the title is Snakes in Suits. Hare is the name of the author. He's an expert on psychopaths and stuff. And he, of course, I know that you don't like to focus just on that topic, but I just remember the conclusion of that book is really that very often the bully is left, or the mobber is left, and everybody else is left. And I also remember when reading once, because I think it's very rare that you actually are able to have a solution which is fair. Often this is especially if the issue is with hierarchy and people in different levels of power and so on. And I remember reading this. The saying once, I don't know whose quote it was, but it was like, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy?
Exactly. And I had to, after it all happened with me, when I finally decided to settle my lawsuit, I knew I can get a lot more money if I go to court, or they could destroy me even more publicly. The minute I settled my lawsuit, I felt an enormous relief.
Yeah.
But there still were a few years of recovery and grief. I lost everything. I mean, I went from being a professor to literally cleaning toilets, cleaning people's homes. I went to work as a secretary for someone I'd been a secretary for long before I went to grad school. And here I was typing his papers again. It was a really devastating setback, and I had to go through the process of grief. And that process of grief began in the mobbing. And I think that's another thing that helps, that people should know, is that, you first have that shock and denial, and then you have the anger, and then you have the bargaining, and then you have the devastation. And so this was all going on with me. And so I was grieving publicly, but didn't know it was grief. After it was all settled, in order to heal and reach that point, I did go through that very devastating period. But I was determined. I would read things like, bullying will destroy your life. And I had bullshit. Bullying will destroy your life if you want it to, if you make that decision to let it destroy your life. I lost everything I had. And I was so publicly humiliated. And I remember I was cleaning out a house for 5 college guys, and I was cleaning their toilets and their oven and their refrigerator. It was so filthy. And I'm thinking, just 1 year ago, I was teaching these students. I was the professor. And now look what I'm doing. But you really have to determine to let go of that anger and rage and bitterness. And, they talk about forgiveness, forgive and forget. I don't know that I would ever forgive them. I can understand some of them. But I can certainly forget them. I can erase them from my mind and life and move on. And I've rebuilt another life. I have, if anything, I'm making much more money now than I was then. And I've bought a home worth far more than my other home. And, so I'm rebuilding my finances. I've rebuilt a network of friends. I think, I had to make the decision to be happy and to not let them destroy me, even though they took so much from me. In the same way, someone who loses a child, you can never get that child back. You will never recover from that loss, but that doesn't mean you can't have a life.
Yeah. No, that's really nice to hear that, and encouraging as well, because I can imagine somebody going through as tough experience as you do, there might be some pretty bad outcomes as well sometimes. I mean, Yeah, sometimes
suicide is common.
Yeah.
And I absolutely got to the point where I thought my life was so worthless. My daughter would be better without me if I was as horrible as they were saying. And then, I told one friend, and of course she then like, oh, she's going to kill herself. She's making death threats. And then it's just like, and the truth is a lot of people do commit suicide. And in fact, I have never talked to a mobbing target who didn't consider it. And it's, so it's understandable because your whole identity is taken away from you. And if it's related to the workplace where your economy is taken away, nobody would hire me. One Google, and I was 50 years old. No, I had a destroyed reputation and career, I couldn't get any job at all. And so I can understand why people do reach that point. And I think it's tragic because it does drive people to suicide. It drives people to homicide. There have been a couple of workplace shootings where I read into it and like, oh yeah, they were being mobbed. And there's even a documentary out on Going Postal about how the abuse of postal workers led to workplace shootings. I think there is absolutely no reason to treat a person that badly. And that is one of my concerns with the anti-bully literature, is it encourages treating them that badly. Make sure they never work again. And well, that's pretty dangerous and foolish and inhumane. But I really just think we've got to encourage more humanity in the workplace. And at the point, when it happened to me, I reached the point where I thought it does no good to talk about my story alone. Just tell my story. It becomes a he said, she said. What was more important was to raise awareness about the phenomenon itself, so that if you hear my story, you understand it in the context of a real social phenomenon that happens. And, I hear from people every day. I get an email from somebody, some part of the world, who, they will say something like, I didn't know it was a thing. I just thought it was me.
Yeah. I think a lot of people start there. They think there's something wrong with them, and then they're trying, and that's why it's so important that we have these resources available, that we can learn from other people's experiences. And that's also what I really like about your book, the part where you discuss how you can survive it, how you can better deal with it. And most of us who are, unfortunately, you weren't able to do all those things when you were in the situation yourself, but at least you learned and you processed it, and you shared many really good practical advice, I think, in your book.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of it was, what not to do based on what I did do. But it was, I broke that section in the book up to 3 parts. How to protect yourself emotionally, how to protect yourself socially, and how to protect yourself professionally. And I think all 3 of those are important components.
Yeah.
And, ultimately, I protected myself emotionally, and but it took a lot of work. And, professionally and socially, I had to start over, and I did. And, but it is, I think it's harder the older you become, and mobbing is particularly common with older workers and older people in any community setting. And and that is harder because you have less time to rebuild. But for me, it was like, oh my God, I'm running out of time in this life, and I don't have time to sit around and say, poor, pitiful me. I was bullied out of my job. It's just like, no, I gotta haul ass and make something of my life while I have some years left.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's really, really interesting. And I wonder if you would say a little bit more about, because you said you had in your book, you have 3 things, how to protect yourself emotionally, socially, professionally, and also I think it starts also about how can we help people recognize the situation early so that they start maybe understanding what's going on earlier rather than later. I like your article there where you talk about the stages of grief and how you can recognize which stage you're in, for instance, and that can give you some
how do you recognize the stages of mobbing? That can be even trickier. One of the things with mobbing is it almost always follows an incident. It's like in Philip Roth's book, The Human Stain, he talks about the incident. And there's often that kind of, a report filed, a complaint made, or it might be something said at a meeting that riles up some people, some kind of provoking incident. Now, you usually have always been marked as an outsider, different before that. And so the person who is one of the few women in a group of men, or vice versa, one of the, somebody who might stand out politically, the conservative in a group of progressives, or it might be, a person stands out by their race or their nationality or their sexuality or their age, whatever. Something has made you noticeably different. But that difference might have no meaning until the incident. And then the incident's like, you see. So there will often be that. You begin to see subtle little things in write-ups, in reviews, annual reviews. It might just be, you might be doing a great job, but they leave a little line of it's their little loophole. Or as one secretary told me prior to my mobbing, when I discovered she was going after an incompetent secretary who was a kind woman, but really incompetent. And she said, well, I always keep two files. There's the official file, and then there's that extra file in case we ever need it, So always, I think just never be too certain in any job or any group setting. You can always be cast out, which is one reason people will engage in mobbing, because those who are more aware of how easy it is to cast a person out. But I think pay attention to your intuition. The little, the fake smiles, the glancing away, the turning when you enter a group or where you feel like they just stopped talking. Now, and there's such a fine line between paranoia and, my subtitle of my book, Mobbed, What to Do When They Really Are Out to Get You. Well, I hear from people who are, the light bulbs are out to get them. So there is such a fine line, and that's something you got to be aware of. Don't presume, we got to set our egos aside. It's easy to say, they were talking about me. Well, maybe they weren't. Maybe it had nothing to do with you, Maybe the fact that coworker didn't pay any attention to you is about the fight they had with their husband that day. It has nothing to do with you. So you got to be self-aware enough to know that this might have nothing to do with you. But if you begin to feel it's happening a lot, social events where you're not told about, especially meetings you aren't informed of, or that you used to be included in these events on these committees, and now suddenly you aren't. If you've been gone for a period of time, whether that's for illness, childcare, whatever, you went on a long vacation, sometimes those long absences, when you return, might be times when mobbing starts. So you got to pay attention to your intuition, and at the same time be self-aware enough to know, is this really about you? And if so, why might it be? What might, are you a gossip? Are you hypercritical? Are you a bully? Do you abuse people, or could you be perceived as abusing people even if that's not your intent? Do you keep to yourself so much that nobody feels they know you? So I think self-reflection and social awareness are important. But once you start getting the investigation, if there's a formal investigation, or you've been pulled aside and told, people are saying this about you, that's when you should maybe start packing your bags.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember you also had very good advice in your book about keeping records. You even give like a little overview of how to do that, because that was one thing that I started when I had, I mean, not that I didn't have an experience nowhere near as extreme as yours, but I also started keeping records, and that became really big after a while, and you know, like too much. So
and actually at one point I was thinking of trying to write like some kind of notebook, workbook for doing that. It's tricky, and I think it differs if this is a workplace setting or outside of work. If it's outside of work, you may want to start keeping a journal and use that journal to begin to see patterns in others and in yourself, and to heal. And as you know, when I coach people on writing their books, one of the things I always advise them is you may get to points where you have to stop because you relive those moments. So one of my concerns is if you write too much, you are reliving it. Your brain does not distinguish between when something is happening and you're recalling it. And so you're writing away and you're writing away. And that's what I found myself doing. And I can write really fast and a lot. And then like I've got these, I would send these emails that were like this long that just made me look even crazier than I was. And, you know, but the more I would write about it, the more I would relive it. And so sometimes I think don't. Another caution is, while it's important to document anything, if it's a workplace setting and you have a potential for a lawsuit, anything you write is discoverable. And not only that, I would write in margins of things I'd be bitching about my own attorneys, not realizing my own attorneys are going to see this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand that the more you write, the crazier you look. And the more the opponent, it's counterintuitive. You think, well, the more I get down everything they're doing, the more it'll prove I'm right. And it works the opposite. And people would try to tell me that, but I didn't hear it in my mind at the time, because I just, you know, I got to get it all down. And the things they were doing were just stunning. I still, when I think of just all the things they did and what they went to, it's just astounding. But by writing them all of it and all of it and all of it and all of it, I was reliving it, and I was giving them more fuel to look how obsessed she is. And you want to keep it really sparse, bulleted stuff, dates, comments that you can expand on later, but that you're not reliving and that you're not giving too much detail to. Anything you write, if you're going to have a lawsuit, is going to be discoverable. And at the time you write it, it might not, that might seem cool with you, but boy, get in the hands of attorneys, they can turn anything into evidence against you.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And my experience was also that a lot of the stuff which is going on is so, for a complete outsider to try to understand, it's very difficult to see what's really going on. It's you have to kind of be involved on a daily basis to see those fine, you know, nuances of how something is said or communicated, or how work is distributed, or yeah, and so on. So,
for outsiders, it's, unless you've been through it, you really don't get it.
Yeah.
And there is this tendency to believe, well, if everybody is saying this, then there has to be some truth to it. And so, so for outsiders, and when you're going through it, it's such an emotional process, and you're so enraged and you're so anguished and you're so frightened that anything you do put out does make you look crazy. It's crazy making.
I also like that you really put the finger on the culture, you know, how important the culture is. How do you see that organizational cultures are kind of contributing to this, letting these things happen?
Well, in different ways. One is leadership. If leadership is rewarded for being, for snuffing out any problem, then anyone who brings awareness of that problem is going to be the problem.
Yeah.
You have that hyper competition. Any place where there's a lot of competition for scarce resources, very few raises going out, or in some organizations where, we fire the bottom 5% annually. Anytime you have anything where in competition among your colleagues is encouraged, it's going to be greater. Any time that it's difficult for a person to just quit and leave. And so what kinds of organizations would this be? Universities with the tenure system. Churches where, okay, if you're a pastor of a church, that means not just quitting your church, but quitting your community and going and uprooting your entire family. And that's one thing with faculty. You don't just go get a job at the college next door with another tenure line. You have to uproot your whole family. So anytime mobility is difficult. The military, you can't just say, oh, okay, I'm quit and leave. So whenever quitting is difficult. Now, there are a couple exceptions to that. Mobbing is rampant among the teachers and nurses. It's an astounding number of teachers and nurses I hear from. And yet you could be a teacher, and while you've got a tenure system, it's much easier to get another teaching position in your community. Same with nurses. You could get another one. But in both professions, usually you have a couple of things. One is a single gender predominates. So where you have a single gender predominating, you have not only hyper competition among that gender, but when the other gender begins. So in teaching, as men become primary school teachers and nurses, they become more targeted for mobbing because they're the other, they're different, just as women entering male professions are. And there are very few opportunities for advancement. If you're a teacher, where do you go? Well, you might go into administration, but there aren't a lot of jobs. Same with nursing. You might become the head nurse, director of nursing, not a lot of advancement at a certain level. So those who get those positions cling tenaciously to them often and will swat down any perceived threat. So the person who points out a problem is quickly gone. Anyone who could be perceived as a threat to that power or that position. So those are some of the cultural organizational cultural contexts in which we see mobbing is fairly common.
Yeah. And I think especially when you talk about mobbing, which is this, when it becomes a group aggression, very often it's also a dysfunctional culture.
Often so, just like in genocide periods of social instability, anytime like, okay, we're going to have, we're reorganizing, new management comes in. Whenever you have a new manager, that can, you're more vulnerable. But anytime where suddenly no raises this year.
Yeah, wow. Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I mean, I know that we are also getting towards, I know that you have other things coming up, but let me, as a final question, like, what is something I haven't asked you, which you would like to share?
Oh, I don't know. We didn't talk about animal behavior, which I get into in my book, but, buy my book, Mobbed: What to Do When They Are Out to Get You, or get it from your library. But I talk there about the different ways in which animals, we're one of the few species which will organize against our own kind to drive some. But there are some interesting examples in the animal kingdom that I think are important to look at. But I think one of the things that, for all the talk about bullies and mobbing, it's all focused on the other person, the aggressor. And I think it's important for us every one of us, no matter what our experiences are in this phenomenon, is to look at our own contributions in our own selves. I think every person can reflect back on a time when they engaged in bullying or mobbing, when they were a bystander, when they acted in ways that were hurting. And I think the more we begin to see it in ourselves, the more we can become kinder, more humane people. And that is, to me, a more promising avenue to take. Instead of talking about the other psychopaths out there, let's focus on our own humanity and our own kindness and become better friends, better colleagues, better neighbors, and more self-aware of when we are acting badly or we are the bystander to someone else's someone else suffering.
Yeah, that's really wise words. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it takes a lot of strength, actually, to do that introspection and really look at that. We all need to look at ourselves. I love that as a message, because in one way or another, we are all contributing to this. It's a systemic issue. How can we, if we want to make things better, we always have to start with ourselves. That's also
absolutely. Well, thank you, Norun, for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much as well. We will put. Do you want to share also quickly how people can find you? Maybe remind people about the name of your book again, and put it also in the text under the video.
Let's see. I don't even know what my own book is. You can find me at janiceharper.com.
Yeah,
and I should have had this ready to go. I know I have a book somewhere. Here it is.
Oh, great.
I have many. I've written like 20 books in the last since I lost my job. But this one, Mobbed, What to Do When They Really Are Out to Get You. And I think it's, I would love to revise it, but I got too much else on my plate. But I think it does, even though it's my own book, I do think that it has some valuable, helpful information for anyone going through this experience. And there are others out there. Richard Schwint has written on the topic of mobbing, and Duffy and Spears have written on mobbing. So there are a couple of others, and there's a book that's been out for years on mobbing by Davenport and a few other authors. So I really want to encourage, look at their literature too, because the number of people are writing on this topic now. So I think if it is happening to you, step beyond the anti-bully literature. There's stuff you can get from it that's really helpful, and nobody should be bullied and no one should put up with it. But if it looks like it's more than one person, you can fall victim if you're not aware of the group psychology. So look at the literature on group psychology, to see how it becomes different than that one-on-one aggression, because group aggression is more insidious and far more damaging, and you want to be prepared. And finally, if you see the guys in black suits walking up and down the street and you think they're gang stalking you, no, they're Jehovah's Witnesses. You aren't being, unless you're Edward Snowden, you are not being gang stalked. The government is not out to get you. And as people said to me, well, how did you know the FBI was after you? Well, they knocked on the door and they showed me their identification, So no, gang stalking, if you think you're being gang stalked, that's not mobbing, and please seek help. But mobbing is real. Group aggression in any organizational setting or any group setting does happen, and it's not your fault. But there may be things you're doing that are keeping the flames burning. And the more that you become self-aware and the more that you become aware of how the phenomenon operates, the better you can protect yourself. And once you get out of the setting in which you're being mobbed, unless you're suing them, it will stop. If you think it's continuing, see a therapist. But because it doesn't, once they've eradicated you, they're done. And that creates a sense of unity among the group for a short period of time. They're happy you're gone. But once you get out, start rebuilding your life and bring yourself joy, and know that your life may never be the same, but it's still a life. You still deserve it. And do a lot of introspection, but do it with loving kindness and gentleness toward yourself. And I think that's the best advice I can give anyone going through this.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think it's really, I mean, even for somebody who, even if it's not a full-fledged group aggression that somebody might be facing, there's always some kind of group dynamics going on in every case. So that's also where I find your book very valuable, to have that understanding and being able to identify if it goes that way. And
absolutely, look at our politics right now. So whichever side you're on, I mean, I think there's one side far more prone to genocide than the other, but whatever side you're on, look at the ways in which so much of our views are shaped by wanting to belong to a certain group and feeling you'll be casting people out, anytime, like, we're going to, never watch their movies again, never listen to their comedy again, and all that. So look at the ways in which in our ordinary lives that we engage in that groupthink.
Yes, and also how a friend of mine was just pointing this out recently, because in her country there was I think a comedian which had been super well liked and popular, and then something happened and suddenly there was some kind of scandal, and she was like really shocked at seeing how quickly people like completely turned. And often it's, I think, based on rumors, or how sure can we really be? I think we all need some introspection there as well. Whenever we decide to, or feel like we align with something we think is the truth, we really need to look at, is it really the truth, or how?
As well as not allowing any imperfections. I mean, I grew up listening to comedians I thought were hilarious who would say sexist crap that, I can hear that sexist crap and not say, okay, they should never tell another joke again. There's we have to give, if we live in a world in which we say, if you step outside the bounds we set, if you say one thing that offends us, then you should never be in our company again. People won't grow. People won't learn. If we want people to grow and to learn, we have to grow and learn ourselves and make space for imperfection, and make space for people to grow and change, and for people to differ in a multitude of ways from ourselves.
Yeah. Wow, I think that's wonderful last few words. So I'm gonna, I'll say goodbye to you here. I'm stopping the recording. Let me just find them.
Well, thank you so much.